Lord have mercy. What in Sam Hill? Grace Eleanor McKenna's words died in her throat as she opened her cabin door to the most impossible sight of her 67 years. There on her weathered porch sat Mama Wild, the bobcat she'd been secretly feeding through the harsh Tennessee winter. But the wild cat wasn't alone. At her feet lay a small, motionless form, little Toby, barely breathing. His hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Mama Wild's amber eyes locked onto Grace's, and in that desperate gaze was a plea that transcended every boundary between human and beast. The mother had brought her dying child to the only source of help she knew. Grace's arthritic hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe. 72 hours. That's what the old veterinary textbook said, 72 hours to save a critically injured wild animal, or lose them forever. The clock had started ticking. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Grace's nursing instincts kicked in before her fear could paralyze her. She knelt slowly, speaking in the gentle tone she'd used with countless patients over 30 years at Mercy General. Easy now, Mama. I see him. I see your baby. Little Toby's chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. Blood matted his tawny fur, and that twisted leg made Grace's stomach clench. She'd seen enough compound fractures to know this wasn't something that would heal on its own. Moving with deliberate care, she wrapped the injured kitten in Harold's old flannel shirt, the one that still smelled like Old Spice and motor oil. Mama Wild tensed but didn't retreat, her golden eyes never leaving Grace's face. I know, honey. I know it's scary, Grace whispered, more to herself than the bobcat. Her hands found their steady rhythm, the same calm competence that had carried her through 43 years of marriage and 3 decades of nursing. We're going to help him. Inside the cabin, she dialed Dr. Samuel Whitehorse with trembling fingers. The Cherokee veterinarian had been Harold's fishing buddy, though Grace was beginning to suspect those fishing trips had involved more than rainbow trout. Sam, it's Grace McKenna. I need your help, and I need it now. Gracie, it's barely 7 in the morning. What's wrong? I've got an injured bobcat kitten. His mother brought him to my door. The words sounded insane even as she spoke them. A long pause. Say that again. You heard me right. That bobcat I told you about, the one that's been coming around. She brought her injured baby to my porch. Sam, he's in bad shape. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Sam breathed. Grace, listen to me carefully. You've got maybe 72 hours. Probably less, if that kitten has internal injuries. Can you see him? Bring him in. But Grace, his voice turned serious, this isn't just about veterinary care. Wildlife rehabilitation is complicated. There are laws, regulations, and if Ezra Thornton finds out you've been feeding wild animals... Grace glanced out the window at her neighbor's property. Ezra had made his feelings about interfering with nature crystal clear at last month's town council meeting. I don't give a damn about Ezra Thornton right now. Fair enough. But, Gracie, at your age, don't you start with that at my age nonsense, Samuel Whitehorse. Harold always said, when someone needs help, you don't ask why, you ask how. That little one needs help, and I'm asking how. Sam chuckled, despite the circumstances. Sounds like Harold, Bring him in. I'll clear my morning schedule." As Grace prepared for the 20-minute drive to town, she caught sight of Harold's photograph on the mantel. His weathered face seemed to approve. "Well, old man," she muttered, "looks like you left me one more adventure." 6 months earlier, Grace had been cleaning out Harold's workshop when she found the diary hidden behind a loose board. For 43 years of marriage, she thought she knew every secret her husband kept. She was wrong. The leather-bound journal was filled with Harold's careful handwriting, documenting 20 years of encounters with wildlife that he'd never mentioned to a soul. But it was the entry dated 3 days before his heart attack that stopped her cold. "Gracie don't know, but I've been keeping a promise made 40 years ago. Old Joseph Clearwater made me swear on his deathbed that someone would always watch over the bobcat family that lives in these mountains. Says they're sacred to his people, guardian spirits in animal form. I thought it was just old Cherokee superstition until I started feeding the grandmother of the one that comes around now. There's something different about them, something almost human in their eyes. If anything happens to me, I pray Gracie will understand." Grace had sat in that dusty workshop for 2 hours, tears streaming down her face as she read entry after entry. Harold documenting injured raccoons he'd nursed back to health, a family of foxes he'd helped through a harsh winter, and always, always, the bobcats. The mama cat had 3 kittens this spring. One didn't make it, found him by the creek, peaceful as you please, buried him under the old oak where Gracie's roses bloom brightest, seemed fitting somehow. That explained the mysterious holes she'd found in her garden over the years. The ones Harold claimed were from settling soil. The most shocking revelation came in an entry from 15 years ago. "Had to take the injured bobcat to Sam Whitehorse today. Told Gracie I was going fishing with him," which was partly true. We were fishing for ways to save that poor creature's life. Sam's Cherokee heritage runs deep, and he understands about the sacred promise. He's been helping me in secret all these years. Says his grandfather would be proud. Grace had confronted Sam the very next day, marching into his veterinary clinic with the diary clutched in her hands like evidence in a murder trial. "How long have you known?" she demanded. Sam had looked up from examining a German shepherd and sighed deeply. "Wondered when you'd find that old journal. Harold said he hid it where you'd never look behind his fishing tackle. It was behind loose boards in his workshop. Crafty old bastard. He knew you'd clean that place out eventually." Sam had gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Gracie. There's more you need to know." That's when Sam told her about Joseph Clearwater, his great-grandfather, who'd been the last traditional keeper of the mountain spirits. Joseph had lived to be 97, spending his final years searching for someone to continue the sacred duty of protecting the guardian animals. Harold was working construction on the new highway back in '83, Sam explained. Found Joseph collapsed by the roadside, barely breathing. Instead of just calling an ambulance, Harold stayed with him, held his hand while they waited. Joseph was delirious, talking about failing his ancestors, about the spirits being left unprotected. Harold thought he was just rambling, but he promised anyway, told Joseph he'd look after whatever needed protecting. Grace had felt a chill run down her spine. And Joseph recovered, lived another 15 years. But here's the thing. Gracie, the very next week, Harold found the first injured bobcat, a young female, caught in a trap someone had set illegally. He brought her to my grandfather's clinic. When Grandpa saw her, he nearly fell over. Said she had the mark. What mark? Sam had pulled out an old photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a bobcat with distinctive markings, white patches around the eyes that formed an almost symmetrical pattern. The Clearwater family has been watching for bobcats with these markings for over 200 years. Legend says they're the physical form of mountain spirits, protectors of the land and its people. Grace had stared at the photo, her heart pounding. The markings were identical to those on Mama Wild. So Harold wasn't just feeding stray cats, she'd whispered. No, Gracie. He was keeping a sacred promise. And from what you've told me about the bobcat coming to your place, I'd say the responsibility has passed to you. That conversation had changed everything. Grace began leaving food for Mama Wild. At first just scraps, then proper nutrition after researching what bobcats needed. She'd installed motion-activated cameras to monitor the feeding area, discovering that Mama Wild had indeed given birth to kittens in late spring, but winter had been brutal, the worst in 30 years. 2 of the 3 kittens hadn't survived, and Grace had found their small bodies buried under the snow, just as Harold had found others over the years. She'd wrapped them in soft towels and buried them near Harold's grave, whispering apologies to the mountain spirits. The surviving kitten, the one she'd started calling Little Toby after Harold's middle name, had grown into a beautiful young male with his mother's distinctive markings. Grace had watched him learn to hunt, had celebrated silently when she saw him catch his first rabbit, had worried through every cold snap and storm. But she'd never imagined Mama Wild would trust her enough to bring her injured baby to the cabin door. Now, as Grace carefully wrapped little Toby in Harold's flannel shirt, she understood the weight of the promise her husband had carried all those years. This wasn't just about saving one animal, it was about honoring a sacred trust that spanned generations. 43 years married, and I'm still learning who you were, she whispered to Harold's memory as she prepared to drive to Sam's clinic. But for the first time since her husband's death, Grace felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her daily routine of coffee, crossword puzzles, and evening television. Harold's final diary entry, written the night before his heart attack, had been prophetic. Getting old, and my hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Hope I've got a few more years to keep the promise. But if the good Lord has other plans, I trust he'll send someone to take my place. Maybe even Gracie, though she'd probably think I've lost my mind if she knew about all this. But my Gracie's got the biggest heart of anyone I know. If she ever finds this journal, I hope she'll understand that some promises are too important to break, even when the one who made them is gone. As Grace loaded little Toby into her old Buick, with Mama Wild watching from the tree line, she felt Harold's presence as surely as if he were sitting in the passenger seat. The promise would not be broken, not on her watch. The 20-minute drive to Sam's clinic felt like an eternity. Grace kept glancing in the rearview mirror, where Mama Wild followed at a distance, darting between trees and staying just visible enough to track their progress. The bobcat's determination both amazed and terrified her. Little Toby lay motionless in the carrier beside her. His breathing so shallow Grace had to keep checking to make sure he was still alive. Every pothole made her wince, imagining the pain it might cause his broken body. "Hang on, baby," she whispered. "Just hang on a little longer." Sam's clinic sat on the outskirts of Piney Creek, a modest building that served the farming community's livestock and the occasional household pet. As Grace pulled into the parking lot, she noticed Ezra Thornton's pickup truck parked across the street at Miller's feed store. Her heart sank. Ezra emerged from the store carrying a bag of grain just as Grace was lifting little Toby's carrier from her car. His weathered face turned thunderous when he spotted Mama Wild crouched behind a nearby oak tree. "Grace McKenna, what in the hell do you think you're doing?" Ezra marched across the street, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd served on the town council for 15 years. "Is that a wild bobcat you're toting around?" "Mind your own business, Ezra," Grace replied, but her voice lacked conviction. At 72, Ezra still cut an intimidating figure 6 feet tall with the bearing of the Marine sergeant he'd once been. "It becomes my business when you're endangering the community. Wild animals carry diseases. Grace, they attack children, and feeding them is illegal in this county." "He's injured, Ezra. His mother brought him to my door." Ezra's harsh laugh held no humor. "His mother, Jesus Christ, Grace, listen to yourself. You sound like one of those crazy cat ladies from the city." "Harold would be ashamed." The words hit like a physical blow. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but before she could respond, Sam appeared in the clinic doorway. "Ezra Thornton, I suggest you move along before I call Sheriff Davidson about you harassing my patients," Sam said, his normally gentle voice carrying an edge Grace had never heard before. "Your patients, Sam. You can't be serious about treating that thing." "That thing is a critically injured animal that needs medical attention. Last I checked, that's what veterinarians do." Ezra looked between Grace and Sam, his face reddening. "This is insanity. I'm calling the county wildlife office. They'll put a stop to this nonsense." As Ezra stormed back to his truck, Grace felt her resolve wavering. "Sam, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just a foolish old woman who—" "Stop right there." Sam took the carrier from her trembling hands. "You're not foolish, and you're not alone in this. Now come inside and let me examine this little one." The clinic's examination room felt sterile and cold compared to Grace's warm cabin. Sam worked with practiced efficiency, his gentle hands probing little Toby's injuries, while Grace held her breath. "Multiple rib fractures," Sam murmured, running his fingers along the kitten's side. "Compound fracture of the left femur. Possible internal bleeding." He looked up at Grace with grave eyes. "This wasn't caused by a fall or a predator attack. This little guy was hit by a vehicle." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, dear Lord." "The good news is he's young and strong. The bad news is he needs surgery, and he needs it within the next 24 hours. After that, the bone fragments could cause permanent damage." "How much?" Grace asked, though she dreaded the answer. $3,000. Maybe more if there are complications." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. $3,000 was every penny of her savings, the emergency fund she and Harold had scraped together over 30 years. But looking at little Toby's peaceful face, she knew there was really no choice. "Do it," she said quietly. "Grace, think about this. That's a lot of money for what? For keeping a promise my husband made, for honoring something sacred." Grace's voice grew stronger with each word. "Harold left me enough to live on. Sam. He didn't leave me enough to feel guilty about how I spend what's left." Before Sam could respond, the clinic door chimed, and a young woman with a camera around her neck stepped inside. "Excuse me. I'm Jessica Martinez from Channel 7 News. I heard there was a story here about a woman caring for wild bobcats." Grace's stomach dropped. "How did you—" "Anonymous tip came in about 20 minutes ago," Jessica said, her eyes bright with professional interest. "Is it true that a mother bobcat brought her injured baby to your house?" Sam stepped forward protectively. "This is a private medical facility. You need to leave. I'm just looking for the truth. Our viewers love animal stories, especially ones about the bond between humans and wildlife." Through the window, Grace could see Mama Wild pacing anxiously in the parking lot, drawing attention from passers-by. A small crowd was beginning to gather. "Please," Grace said to the reporter, "this isn't about publicity. It's about saving a life." Jessica's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. McKenna?" "Right. Look, I know this seems intrusive, but stories like this can really help. Public support could mean donations for the surgery, maybe even changes to local wildlife protection laws." "I don't need donations," Grace said firmly. "I need privacy." But even as she spoke, Grace could see more vehicles pulling into the parking lot. Word was spreading fast in their small town, and not all the attention would be friendly. Sam checked his watch. "Surgery needs to happen first thing tomorrow morning. That gives us 18 hours to stabilize him and prep for the operation." He looked directly at Grace. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once we start, there's no going back. And even if the surgery succeeds, there's no guarantee he'll ever be releasable into the wild." Grace thought about Harold's diary, about Joseph Clearwater's sacred promise, about Mama Wild's desperate trust. She thought about Ezra's words, "Harold would be ashamed," and felt a surge of defiant clarity. "Harold taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you," she said, "especially then." As if summoned by her words, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her daughter Sarah's number. "Mom, what's this I'm hearing about you harboring wild animals, Mrs.? Patterson just called me. Said there are news trucks at the vet clinic and you're mixed up in some kind of wildlife incident." Grace closed her eyes. Sarah lived 2 hours away in Nashville, close enough to worry, but far enough to not understand the daily rhythms of mountain life. "It's complicated, honey. Mom, you're 67 years old. You shouldn't be handling dangerous wild animals. What if that thing attacks you?" "She won't attack me, Sarah. She trusts me." Mom, listen to yourself. It's not a pet. It's a wild predator." Grace looked at little Toby, so small and vulnerable on Sam's examination table. "Sometimes trust is all we have, sweetheart. Your daddy understood that." The line went quiet for a moment. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was gentler. "Mom, I'm worried about you. Ever since Dad died, you've been so isolated up there. Maybe it's time to consider moving closer to family." "My family is here," Grace said firmly. "In these mountains, with these creatures that your father promised to protect. I'm not abandoning that promise, and I'm not abandoning that little one." After hanging up, Grace felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. 18 hours until surgery. 18 hours to second-guess herself, to listen to the voices telling her she was foolish, to back down from the hardest thing she'd ever chosen to do. But when she looked out the window and saw Mama Wild still waiting, still trusting, Grace knew there was only one choice she could live with. By 10 o'clock that morning, Sam's waiting room had become an unlikely gathering place. Grace sat clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long gone cold. watching through the window as more vehicles arrived. The news van had been joined by pickup trucks, a few curious townspeople, and to Grace's amazement, Reverend Martha Clearwater's ancient Cadillac. The Reverend, Joseph Clearwater's great niece, entered the clinic with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge. At 74, Martha still commanded respect throughout the county, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. "Grace McKenna," Martha said, settling into the chair beside her. "We need to talk." Before Grace could respond, Sam emerged from the back room, his expression grave. "Grace, I need to tell you something about little Toby, something I should have mentioned earlier." Grace's heart clenched. "Is he worse?" "No, he's stable for now. But when I was examining him—" Sam hesitated, glancing at Martha. "I found something that changes everything. This isn't the first time I've treated this particular animal." "What do you mean?" Sam pulled out a manila folder. "I've been keeping records, just like your husband asked me to. Little Toby was born in my clinic 2 years ago. His mother had complications during delivery, and Harold brought her here in the middle of the night." Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. "Harold never told me. He was protecting you," Martha interjected gently. "My great-uncle made him promise to keep the sacred duty secret until the time was right. Harold thought that time would come gradually, when you were ready. He never expected to die so suddenly." Sam opened the folder, revealing photographs and medical records spanning 20 years. "Your husband didn't just feed wildlife, Grace. He ran a complete underground rehabilitation network. Look at this." The photographs showed Harold at different ages, always with Sam, caring for injured animals in what Grace now recognized as the old barn behind their property. There were raccoons, foxes, injured deer, and always, the bobcats with their distinctive white markings. "This barn," Grace whispered, pointing to the background of one photo. "I thought Harold just stored his hunting gear there." "He converted it into a full medical facility," Sam explained. "Surgical equipment, recovery cages, everything we needed. And he wasn't working alone." As if on cue, the clinic door opened and Benjamin Strongbear entered. Grace knew him as the retired high school principal, a quiet Cherokee man who'd taught 3 generations of local children. Behind him came Florence Hartwell, the elderly librarian Grace had known for decades. "Heard there was trouble," Benjamin said simply, his weathered hands carrying a thermos of coffee. "Thought you might need support." Florence sat down across from Grace, her kind eyes bright with determination. "Honey, Sam called us this morning, told us about Harold's journal and what you're trying to do." She reached across to squeeze Grace's hand. "We've been part of this network for 15 years. Grace felt the world shift beneath her feet. "You've—" "What?" "The network," Benjamin explained. "Started with Harold and Sam, but over the years it grew. Joseph Clearwater's promise wasn't just given to one man. It was given to whoever would honor it. Harold recruited us one by one." Florence nodded. "Remember when I supposedly went to visit my sister in Knoxville for 2 weeks last spring? I was actually here, helping nurse 3 orphaned fox kits. And my fishing trips with Harold?" Benjamin smiled. "We were building recovery enclosures and transport cages." Martha leaned forward. "My great-uncle saw this day coming. Grace, He told Harold that eventually the work would grow beyond what one person could handle. That's why Harold documented everything so carefully. He was preparing for the day when the network would need to reveal itself. Sam pulled out another folder, this one thick with legal documents. Which brings us to the real reason I asked everyone here. Grace, Harold didn't just leave you his savings. He left you something much more valuable. Grace's hands shook as Sam placed a deed in front of her. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out: wildlife sanctuary, conservation easement, perpetual trust. I don't understand, Grace whispered. Your husband spent 20 years quietly purchasing land around your property. Martha explained. 47 acres in total, all legally designated as wildlife habitat. He worked with Cherokee Nation attorneys to establish it as a legitimate sanctuary. Benjamin pointed to a line in the document. It's been inactive pending the appointment of a primary caretaker. Harold designated you as his successor, but only if you chose to accept the responsibility. Grace stared at the papers, her mind racing. This is why he never told me. He wanted it to be my choice. Exactly, Sam said. And there's more. The sanctuary designation comes with legal protections. No one, not Ezra Thornton, not the county commissioners, not even the state wildlife department, can interfere with legitimate animal rehabilitation activities conducted on sanctuary grounds. Florence smiled. Honey, what you're doing isn't just legal. It's your right as the sanctuary director. The clinic door chimed again, and this time Ezra Thornton entered, his face red with anger. Behind him came 2 men in official-looking uniforms. There she is, Ezra announced. The woman I told you about. One of the uniformed men stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm Officer Bradley with Tennessee Wildlife Resources. We've received complaints about illegal wildlife feeding and harboring of dangerous animals. Grace felt her newfound confidence waver. But Martha stood up with surprising agility. Officer Bradley, I'm Reverend Martha Clearwater, legal counsel for the Clearwater Wildlife Sanctuary. She handed him a laminated document. Mrs. McKenna is operating under full legal authority as sanctuary director. All activities are conducted in accordance with state and federal wildlife rehabilitation statutes. Officer Bradley examined the document, his expression changing from authority to confusion. This appears to be in order, but nothing. Benjamin interjected. The sanctuary has been legally established for 20 years. We've just been waiting for the right time to become operational. Ezra's face grew even redder. This is ridiculous. Since when does Grace McKenna run a wildlife sanctuary? Since her husband designated her as director in his will, Florence said sweetly. All perfectly legal and documented. Officer Bradley looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, we still need to inspect the facilities and ensure all proper permits are in place. Sam nodded. Of course, we welcome inspection. But I should mention that the sanctuary operates under Cherokee Nation oversight as well as state authority. Any interference with sacred animal protection could result in federal complications. Grace watched this exchange with growing amazement. In the space of 2 hours, she'd gone from a frightened widow breaking the law to the director of an established wildlife sanctuary with legal protections she'd never dreamed of. Harold, she whispered under her breath. You crafty old fool. Officer Bradley handed the documents back to Martha. We'll need to schedule a formal inspection, but for now, everything appears legitimate. He turned to Ezra. Sir, I suggest you direct any further complaints through proper channels. As the officers left, Ezra turned on Grace with barely controlled fury. "You think you're clever, don't you? But this isn't over. I'll find a way to shut this down." "Ezra," Martha said calmly, "I'd be careful about making threats against a federal and state-recognized wildlife sanctuary, particularly one with Cherokee Nation protection." After Ezra stormed out, Grace sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. "I can't believe Harold kept all this secret." "He was protecting you," Sam said gently. "He knew that once you learned about the network, you'd throw yourself into it completely. He wanted you to have time to grieve, to make your own choice about your future." Benjamin poured fresh coffee from his thermos. "But now you know. The question is, are you ready to accept the role he prepared for you?" Grace looked through the window at Mama Wild, still maintaining her vigil in the parking lot. She thought about little Toby fighting for his life in the back room, about Harold's 20-year promise, about the sacred trust passed down through generations. "I've been ready my whole life," she said finally. "I just didn't know it until now." Martha smiled. "Then welcome to the family, Director McKenna. Now let's save that little one and show this community what real wildlife conservation looks like." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Grace found herself caught between two worlds: the present crisis of little Toby's surgery and the overwhelming revelations about Harold's secret life. As Sam prepared the surgical suite, Grace stepped outside to call her daughter Sarah, needing to hear a familiar voice in the chaos. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation," Sarah said before Grace could speak. "Maybe I was too harsh. If this animal thing is important to you." "Sarah, honey, there's something I need to tell you about your father." Grace watched Mama Wild through the clinic window, the bobcat's unwavering vigil reminding her of Harold's own steadfast devotion. He wasn't just a retired mechanic who liked to fish. 20 years earlier, Harold McKenna had been a different man than the one his family knew. The flashback began on a humid July morning in 1983, when Harold was working road construction for the new highway project cutting through the Cherokee National Forest. He'd been operating a bulldozer when he spotted movement in the brush, an elderly Cherokee man stumbling along the roadside, clearly in distress. Harold had shut down his machine and climbed down, ignoring the foreman's shouts about delays and deadlines. Joseph Clearwater had been 92 then, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of a century of mountain living. He'd collapsed just as Harold reached him, his breathing labored and shallow. "Easy now, old-timer," Harold had said, cradling the elderly man's head. "Help's coming." But Joseph's eyes had fixed on Harold's with startling intensity. "The spirits," he'd whispered in accented English. "Who will watch over the spirits when I'm gone?" Harold had assumed the old man was delirious from dehydration and heat. "Don't worry about spirits right now. Just rest." "Promise me." Joseph had gripped Harold's work shirt with surprising strength. "The mountain spirits take the form of wild creatures, bobcats with white markings around their eyes. They protect this land, protect our people. Someone must watch over them, feed them when times are hard, heal them when they're hurt." Harold had looked into those ancient eyes and seen a desperation that transcended language barriers. "Okay, old man, I promise. Whatever you need me to do." Joseph had smiled then, his grip relaxing. "Harold McKenna," he'd said, somehow knowing Harold's name, though they'd never met. The spirits chose well. By the time the ambulance arrived, Joseph was stable, and Harold had returned to his bulldozer thinking the encounter was over. But 3 days later, driving home from work on the old mountain road, Harold had found the first bobcat. She'd been caught in an illegal trap, her left front paw mangled but her spirit unbroken. The white markings around her eyes had been unmistakable, exactly as Joseph had described. Harold had spent 2 hours freeing her from the trap, using his work gloves and bolt cutters from his truck. The injured bobcat should have fled the moment she was free. Instead, she'd sat watching Harold with intelligent amber eyes, as if weighing his character. Then she'd limped into the forest, but not before looking back once, almost like a nod of acknowledgement. That weekend, Harold had driven to the Cherokee Reservation to find Joseph Clearwater. The old man had been sitting on his porch, seemingly expecting him. "You found one," Joseph had said without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because the spirits don't waste time when they've found their guardian." Joseph had gestured to a chair beside him. "Sit. There's much you need to learn." Over the course of that summer, Harold had visited Joseph every weekend, learning about the sacred responsibility he'd accepted. The Cherokee elder had taught him to recognize the signs of the guardian spirits, not just the distinctive markings, but their behavior, their unusual intelligence, their willingness to trust humans when help was needed. "Your wife," Joseph had said during one visit. "She has the healing touch. Yes, I've heard talk in town about the nurse who can calm any patient." Harold had nodded proudly. "Grace is special. She's got a gift. Then she is part of this too, though she doesn't know it yet. The spirits will reveal themselves to her when the time is right." But Harold had been protective of Grace's career, knowing that any association with feeding wild animals could jeopardize her standing at the hospital. So he'd kept the promise secret, telling Grace he was going fishing when he was actually checking on injured wildlife or meeting with Sam Whitehorse to coordinate care. Back in the present, Grace finished explaining to Sarah about the wildlife sanctuary and Harold's hidden life. Her daughter's silence stretched so long that Grace wondered if the call had dropped. "Dad was running a secret animal rescue for 20 years, Sarah finally said, "with a whole network of people I thought were just his fishing buddies." "And you never suspected?" Grace thought about all the signs she'd missed Harold's mysterious absences, the veterinary supplies she'd occasionally found in his truck, his uncanny knowledge about wildlife behavior. Your father was good at keeping secrets when he thought it was protecting someone he loved. As they talked, Grace watched through the window as more vehicles arrived at the clinic. Benjamin Strongbear was setting up what looked like a small information booth, complete with pamphlets and a banner reading "Clearwater Wildlife Sanctuary Honoring Sacred Traditions." Florence Hartwell emerged from her car carrying a large thermos and a basket of sandwiches, immediately beginning to distribute food to the growing crowd. Even Martha Clearwater had changed from her Sunday dress into practical work clothes, helping Benjamin arrange folding chairs. "Mom," Sarah said quietly, "I think I need to come up there." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. I never really knew Dad. Did I? Not all of him. And it sounds like I don't really know you either." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Honey, there's a lot about me. I'm just discovering myself." As the afternoon wore on, the crowd outside the clinic grew larger and more diverse. Grace was amazed to see faces she recognized, people she'd known for decades, who were apparently part of Harold's network. Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, arrived with a truck full of lumber and wire fencing. Mary Saligi, the Cherokee Nation cultural liaison, pulled up in an official tribal vehicle. But it was the arrival of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, that truly shocked Grace. The wildlife biologist from the University of Tennessee stepped out of her state-issued SUV, immediately spotting Grace through the window and waving. "Elena's here," Sam announced, entering the waiting room. "She's been consulting on little Toby's case since this morning." Grace stared at him. "Since this morning? How is that possible?" "Harold established research partnerships with 3 universities 20 years ago," Martha explained. "Dr. Rodriguez has been documenting the guardian bobcat bloodline for her doctoral thesis. She's been waiting for an opportunity like this." Dr. Rodriguez entered the clinic, her professional demeanor softening when she saw Grace. "Mrs. McKenna, I can't tell you how honored I am to finally meet you. Your husband's documentation of the bobcat family has been invaluable to our research." Research. The genetic markers, behavioral patterns, territorial ranges. Harold kept meticulous records. "We've been able to establish that this particular bobcat lineage has unique characteristics that make them ideal candidates for conservation success stories." Grace felt overwhelmed by the scope of Harold's hidden work. How many people knew about this? "The core network was small," Benjamin said. "But the support network extended throughout 3 counties. Harold was careful to only involve people who could be trusted completely." Through the window, Grace could see Ezra Thornton's pickup truck parked across the street, the man himself standing with a small group of clearly agitated residents. But they were vastly outnumbered by the sanctuary supporters who continued to arrive throughout the afternoon. "There's something else you should know," Sam said, checking his watch. "The surgery is scheduled for 6 a.m. tomorrow, but we've had an offer of assistance that might change everything." "What kind of assistance?" Dr. Rodriguez pulled out her tablet, showing Grace a video call screen. "The Cherokee Nation Council has offered to send their wildlife veterinarian specialist to assist with the surgery. Dr. Michael Swimmer is one of the top wildlife surgeons in the Southeast." Grace watched as a middle-aged Cherokee man appeared on the video screen, his calm presence immediately reassuring. "Mrs. McKenna," Dr. Swimmer said through the tablet. "I knew Joseph Clearwater personally. He spoke often about Harold's promise and the day when the sanctuary would become fully operational. I'd be honored to help save this little one." As the sun began to set over the mountains, Grace found herself standing in the parking lot, surrounded by dozens of people she'd known for years but never truly understood. The network Harold had built wasn't just about caring for animals, it was about preserving something sacred, something that connected the community to the land and to each other. Mama Wild remained at her post by the oak tree. But now, she wasn't alone. 2 other adult bobcats had appeared at the forest edge, watching the unusual gathering with keen interest. "They know," Martha said softly, following Grace's gaze. "The whole family knows that tomorrow will determine their future." Grace felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, like Harold's old work jacket, heavy but comforting, worn by someone who'd carried it with love. At 8 o'clock that evening, the winter storm that had been threatening all day finally arrived with a vengeance. Grace stood in Sam's clinic, watching through the windows as snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes that quickly turned the parking lot into a treacherous white expanse. "We need to get you home before the roads become impassable," Sam said. But his voice lacked conviction. They both knew that leaving little Toby now felt like abandoning ship. "I'm not going anywhere," Grace replied firmly. "That little one has been fighting for his life all day. The least I can do is stay and fight with him." The power had flickered twice in the past hour, and Sam had already fired up the backup generator just in case. Dr. Swimmer had arrived from Cherokee an hour before the storm hit, bringing specialized surgical equipment that transformed Sam's modest clinic into something resembling a university teaching hospital. "Mrs. McKenna," Dr. Swimmer said, emerging from the surgical prep room. "I need you to understand what we're facing. This surgery would be challenging even under ideal conditions. With the storm threatening our power supply and no way to transport little Toby to a larger facility if complications arise, we're taking significant risks." Grace looked through the window at Mama Wild, who had taken shelter under the clinic's front overhang but refused to leave. Snow clung to her thick winter coat, and her amber eyes never wavered from the building where her son lay, fighting for life. "She's not leaving," Grace said simply. "And neither am I," as if summoned by her words. The lights went out. The backup generator kicked in after a heart-stopping 30 seconds of complete darkness. But the message was clear. They were truly on their own now. The storm had knocked out power throughout the county, and the roads were already too dangerous for emergency vehicles. "Well," Sam said with forced cheerfulness, "looks like we're having ourselves an old-fashioned vigil." Grace settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside little Toby's recovery cage, where the young bobcat lay sedated but breathing steadily. The surgery wasn't scheduled until morning, but Dr. Swimmer had wanted to stabilize the patient overnight and monitor his responses to anesthesia. "Talk to me about Harold," Dr. Swimmer said, pulling up a chair beside Grace. "Joseph Clearwater spoke of him often in his final years, said he'd found a man whose heart was as big as the mountains themselves." Grace smiled despite her exhaustion. "Harold was like that. Never met a creature in need that he could turn away from. I used to think it was just his nature, but now I understand it was something deeper." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Outside, the storm raged with increasing ferocity, piling snow against the windows and howling around the building like a living thing. Inside, the clinic felt increasingly isolated from the world, lit only by the harsh fluorescent lights powered by the steadily humming generator. At midnight, Grace's phone rang. Sarah's number appeared on the screen. "Mom, I'm stuck in Nashville. The interstate is closed, and they're not letting anyone drive north until the storm passes. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, honey. We're all just waiting and praying." "All who's with you?" Grace looked around the clinic's waiting room, surprised to realize how many people had chosen to stay despite the worsening conditions. Sam and Dr. Swimmer, obviously, but also Martha Clearwater, who had settled into a corner with her knitting, and Benjamin Strongbear, who was dozing in a chair with his arms crossed. Florence Hartwell had claimed the small couch and was reading by the light of a battery-powered lantern. The whole network, apparently. Nobody wanted to leave little Toby alone tonight. At 2 a.m, Grace experienced her darkest hour. Little Toby's breathing had become labored, and his temperature was dropping despite the warming blankets. Dr. Swimmer emerged from examining him with a grave expression. "He's going into shock," the surgeon said quietly. "His body is shutting down from the trauma. We may need to move the surgery up. Is he strong enough? I don't know, but waiting might not be an option." Grace knelt beside the recovery cage, placing her hand gently on the glass. Little Toby's eyes were closed, his small body barely moving with each shallow breath. For the first time since finding him on her porch, Grace allowed herself to consider that he might not survive. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." That's when she heard Harold's voice, as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Not a supernatural visitation. Grace was too practical for such nonsense, but the memory of something he'd said during their last conversation before his heart attack. "Gracie," the remembered voice said, "sometimes the loving thing to do isn't the easy thing. Sometimes love means fighting even when you're scared, especially when you're scared." Grace straightened up, something fierce and determined settling in her chest. "Dr. Swimmer, what do you need to give him the best chance? Time, mostly, and prayer wouldn't hurt." "Then let's give him both." What followed was the longest night of Grace's life. She sat beside little Toby's cage, talking to him in the gentle voice she'd used with countless patients over the years. She told him about Harold and the promise, about Mama Wild's courage in bringing him to safety, about the network of people who cared enough to spend a winter night in an emergency clinic. Around 4 a.m, Martha Clearwater joined her beside the cage. "My great-uncle told me something once," the elderly reverend said softly. "He said that the guardian spirits choose their human partners very carefully. Not just anyone can be trusted with a sacred responsibility." "I don't feel very trustworthy right now," Grace admitted. "I feel terrified and out of my depth." "That's exactly how Harold felt 20 years ago. Joseph told me Harold cried the night after he found his first injured bobcat. Said he didn't know the first thing about caring for wild animals and was afraid he'd do more harm than good." Grace looked at Martha in surprise. "Harold cried like a baby, according to my great-uncle. But he didn't let fear stop him from learning, from trying, from caring. That's what made him worthy of the trust." As dawn approached, little Toby's condition stabilized slightly. His breathing became more regular, and his temperature stopped dropping. Dr. Swimmer decided to proceed with the surgery as planned, but the power situation remained precarious. "The generator has enough fuel for about 6 more hours," Sam reported. "After that, we'll be working by flashlight and battery power." Grace made a decision that surprised even herself. "Then we'd better get started." "Grace, you don't have to stay for the surgery. It's going to be several hours, and there's nothing you can do to help." "Yes, there is." Grace looked through the window at Mama Wild, who was still maintaining her vigil despite the continuing snowfall. "I can keep my promise. I can be here when he wakes up, just like she's been here all night." The surgery began at 6:30 that morning, just as the storm began to show signs of weakening. Grace paced the waiting room, alternately praying and talking to Harold's memory, while the rest of the network maintained their supportive presence. 2 hours into the surgery, Swimmer emerged from the operating room, his surgical mask pulled down and exhaustion evident in his eyes. "The leg is repaired," he announced. "The bone fragments were worse than we thought, but we managed to pin everything back together. He's young enough that he should heal well." Grace felt her knees go weak with relief. "He's going to be okay." The surgery was successful, but recovery will be lengthy, and there's still the question of whether he'll ever be able to survive in the wild. Through the window, Grace could see that the snow had stopped falling, Mama Wild was grooming herself in the weak morning sunlight, and for the first time in 18 hours, she looked almost relaxed. "One miracle at a time," Grace said, sinking into her chair with profound gratitude. "One miracle at a time." As little Toby was moved to the recovery room, still unconscious from anesthesia but breathing strongly, Grace finally allowed herself to believe that Harold's promise would not be broken on her watch. The darkest hour was over. Now came the real work of healing. 3 hours after the surgery, as little Toby lay unconscious in the recovery room, Grace experienced the devastating moment that would test everything she believed about love, promises, and the meaning of mercy. "Doctor." Swimmer emerged from his post-surgical examination with an expression that made Grace's stomach drop to her feet. The way he removed his stethoscope, the careful manner in which he set down his medical chart, the gentle clearing of his throat, all signals Grace recognized from her nursing days. Bad news was coming. "Mrs. McKenna, I need you to sit down." Grace remained standing, her hands gripping the back of a plastic chair. "Just tell me." "The surgery was successful in terms of repairing the bone damage. The pins are holding and there's no sign of infection. But during the procedure, we discovered something else." "Doctor." Swimmer paused, choosing his words carefully. "Little Toby has suffered significant spinal trauma. The vehicle strike damaged his lower spine in a way that we couldn't detect without surgery." The words hit Grace like physical blows. "What does that mean?" "It means he'll never walk normally again. His hind legs have very limited function, and he'll never be able to hunt, climb, or defend himself as a wild bobcat should." Sam, who had been cleaning surgical instruments, stopped what he was doing. Martha Clearwater's knitting needles went still. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "He's paralyzed," Grace whispered. "Partially. He can move his legs slightly, but he'll never have the strength or coordination necessary for survival in the wild. In human terms, we'd call it a severe disability that would require lifetime care." Grace felt the world tilting beneath her feet. She thought about Harold's diary, about the promise made to Joseph Clearwater, about Mama Wild's desperate trust in bringing her son to a human door. Had she failed them all? "What are you saying, that we should put him down?" Dr. Swimmer's expression was infinitely compassionate. "I'm saying we need to have a conversation about quality of life. A disabled bobcat can't survive in the wild, but keeping him alive might be more cruel than kind. In veterinary medicine, we sometimes have to choose between what we want and what's best for the animal." Grace looked through the window at Mama Wild, who was now grooming herself in the morning sun, seemingly confident that her son was safe. How could Grace face those trusting amber eyes and explain that saving little Toby might mean condemning him to a life of captivity and dependence? "There's something else," Dr. Swimmer continued gently. "Even if we decide to keep him alive, the cost of lifetime care for a disabled wild animal is enormous. We're talking about specialized housing, daily medical care, modified diet, constant monitoring." "The sanctuary designation helps with legalities, but it doesn't provide funding." Sam sat down heavily in a nearby chair. "We're looking at maybe 20 years of intensive care, thousands of dollars annually." Grace thought about her savings, already depleted by the surgery. She thought about her modest Social Security income, about the reality of caring for a disabled animal while aging herself. The practical voice in her head, the voice that sounded suspiciously like Ezra Thornton, whispered that she was being selfish, keeping an animal alive for her own emotional needs rather than his welfare. But then she remembered something else from Harold's diary. An entry from 5 years ago. Found a raccoon today with a twisted front paw, probably from birth. Most folks would say to put him down, that a disabled wild animal is better off dead. But I watched him for an hour, and that little fellow was figuring out how to do everything the other raccoons do, just differently. Made me think about what we mean when we say quality of life. Who gets to decide what life is worth living? I need to see him, Grace said suddenly. Dr. Swimmer hesitated. He's still unconscious from the anesthesia. He won't wake up for several hours. I don't care. I need to see him now. In the recovery room, little Toby looked impossibly small on the surgical table. His hind legs were wrapped in bandages, and various monitors tracked his vital signs. But his breathing was strong and steady, and his distinctive white markings around his eyes seemed to give him an almost peaceful expression. Grace placed her hand gently on his head, feeling the soft fur and the warmth of life beneath. "What would you want, little one?" she whispered. "If you could choose, what would you want?" As if in answer to her question, little Toby's eyes fluttered open, still groggy from anesthesia. He focused on Grace's face with difficulty, but when she spoke softly to him, his ears twitched forward in recognition. "Hey there, baby. You're safe now. Your mama brought you to the right place." Little Toby made a soft, chirping sound, not quite a meow, but the vocalization young bobcats use to communicate with their mothers. It was a sound of trust, of contentment, of an animal that wasn't ready to give up on life. Dr. Swimmer, who had followed Grace into the recovery room, watched this interaction with professional interest. That's a very good sign neurologically. His cognitive function appears completely normal. Over the next hour, as little Toby became more alert, Grace and the medical team observed something remarkable. Despite his limited mobility, the young bobcat showed every sign of wanting to engage with his environment. He was curious about the sounds around him, alert to movement, and clearly bonded to Grace's voice and presence. "He's not acting like an animal in distress," Martha observed, having joined them in the recovery room. "He's acting like an animal that wants to live." But it was Benjamin Strongbear who provided the perspective that changed everything. The retired educator had been quietly observing from the corner, his weathered face thoughtful. "You know," he said slowly, "we've been thinking about this all wrong. We keep talking about whether little Toby can survive in the wild. But what if the wild isn't where he's supposed to be?" Everyone turned to look at him. Joseph Clearwater used to say that the guardian spirits took many forms. Sometimes they were meant to roam free, protecting the forest. But sometimes they were meant to stay close to humans, teaching them about the connection between all living things. Dr. Swimmer frowned. "You're talking about keeping him as an educational animal." "I'm talking about something more than that," Benjamin replied. "What if little Toby's purpose isn't to hunt in the forest, but to help humans understand what it means to care for something vulnerable? What if his disability isn't a tragedy, but a different kind of calling? Grace felt something shift in her understanding. She thought about her years as a nurse, caring for patients who would never fully recover, but whose lives still had meaning and purpose. She thought about Harold's conviction that every life had value, regardless of its limitations. "The sanctuary," she said suddenly. Harold designed it to be more than just a rehabilitation center. He wanted it to be an educational facility. Sam's eyes lit up with understanding. A place where people could learn about wildlife conservation, see the animals up close, understand the impact of human activity on wild populations. Dr. Swimmer was already looking at little Toby with new eyes. An ambassador animal. He could teach thousands of people about bobcat behavior, about the importance of wildlife corridors, about responsible interaction with wild animals. Martha smiled. And he'd be teaching them something else, too, about resilience, about adapting to challenges, about the value of every life. As if sensing the change in the room's energy, little Toby lifted his head slightly and made that soft, chirping sound again. Through the window, Mama Wild could be seen moving closer to the building, as if she too sensed that something important was being decided. "It won't be easy," Dr. Swimmer warned. "He'll need specialized care for the rest of his life. Physical therapy, modified housing, ongoing medical monitoring." Grace looked down at little Toby, who was now watching her with bright, alert eyes. In those amber depths, she saw not a tragic victim, but a survivor, a fighter, a little soul that had chosen to trust humans when he had every reason not to. "Harold always said that the best things in life aren't easy," Grace replied. "They're just worth doing." The decision was made. Little Toby would live, not as a wild bobcat, but as something new, a bridge between the human and natural worlds. A teacher whose very existence would remind people that every life has value, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is not letting go, but holding on and adapting together. 6 months later, Grace stood on her wraparound porch watching the morning sun filter through the tall pines, just as she had every day for the past 3 years. But everything else had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Little Toby's specialized habitat occupied the meadow behind her cabin, a beautifully designed enclosure that looked more like a natural park than a cage. The young bobcat had adapted to his mobility challenges with remarkable ingenuity, using his strong front legs and modified platforms to navigate his world with surprising grace. His morning routine included hunting enrichment toys that Sam had designed, practicing his pouncing skills on targets positioned at just the right height for his abilities. "Morning, handsome," Grace called softly, and little Toby chirped in response, a sound that had become as familiar to her as Harold's morning coffee ritual had once been. The educational programs had exceeded everyone's expectations. 3 days a week, the Clearwater Wildlife Sanctuary welcomed school groups, families, and researchers who came to learn about local wildlife conservation. Little Toby had proven to be a natural ambassador, seeming to enjoy the attention while demonstrating that wild animals were individuals with personalities, intelligence, and dignity. "He's showing off again," Sarah said, joining Grace on the porch with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Grace's daughter had taken early retirement from her teaching job in Nashville to help run the sanctuary's educational programs, a decision that had surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. "Your father would be proud," Grace told her daughter, watching as Sarah scattered enrichment treats around little Toby's enclosure with practiced ease. The sanctuary had become something Harold could never have envisioned, but would have wholeheartedly embraced. The network had grown to include volunteers from 3 counties, university researchers studying human-wildlife interaction, and a partnership with Cherokee Nation that brought traditional ecological knowledge into modern conservation practices. Dr. Swimmer visited monthly, not just to check on little Toby's health, but to document the remarkable bond between the disabled bobcat and his human caregivers. The research had already resulted in 2 published papers on adaptive behavior in captive wildlife and the therapeutic benefits of interspecies relationships for elderly caregivers. "We've got the school group from Knoxville coming today," Sarah reminded her mother. 42 third graders who are very excited to meet the famous bobcat who can't walk right but is super smart anyway. Grace smiled at the description. Children had a way of seeing past disability to the essential spirit of an individual, whether human or animal. Their questions were always the most insightful. Does he know he's different? Is he sad he can't run? Does he still love his mama? The answer to that last question was the most remarkable part of the story. Mama Wild had never left the area. She'd established her territory in the forest surrounding the sanctuary, and every evening at dusk, she would appear at the edge of little Toby's enclosure for what Grace had come to think of as their daily visit. The reunion conversations between mother and son were conducted in soft chirps and trills that seemed to communicate far more than simple animal vocalizations. Dr. Swimmer had documented these interactions extensively, noting that Mama Wild showed none of the typical behaviors associated with mourning a lost offspring. Instead, she seemed to accept that her son was safe and cared for, even if his life had taken an unexpected path. "She knows he's where he belongs," Martha Clearwater had observed during one of these evening visits. Sometimes, a mother's greatest gift isn't keeping her child close, but trusting others to help him become who he's meant to be. The legal challenges had come and gone. Ezra Thornton had filed 3 separate complaints with various regulatory agencies, all of which had been dismissed once officials saw the professional operation Grace and her team had established. The sanctuary's combination of Cherokee Nation oversight, university research partnerships, and state permits created a legal framework that was virtually unassailable. More importantly, public opinion had shifted dramatically in favor of the sanctuary. The local newspaper had run a series of articles about the project. National Geographic had featured little Toby in a story about adaptive wildlife management, and the sanctuary's social media presence had attracted supporters from around the world. "You know what the best part is?" Grace asked Sarah as they watched little Toby navigate his morning routine with characteristic determination. "What's that?" "I finally understand what Harold meant about promises. I thought keeping the promise meant saving little Toby's life. But that was just the beginning. The real promise was about creating something that would last beyond our own lives." The sanctuary had indeed become a legacy project. A trust fund established with donations and Harold's carefully saved money would ensure the facility's operation for decades to come. More importantly, the educational programs were inspiring a new generation of conservation advocates. Benjamin Strongbear had developed a curriculum that combined traditional Cherokee ecological wisdom with modern conservation science. Students who visited the sanctuary didn't just learn about bobcats, they learned about their connection to the natural world and their responsibility as stewards of the environment. "Grace?" Florence Hartwell called from the parking area, waving a manila envelope. "You're going to want to see this." The letter was from the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, officially designating the Clearwater Wildlife Sanctuary as a state-recognized environmental education center. The designation came with annual funding, expanded research opportunities, and the possibility of caring for additional non-releasable wildlife. "We did it," Grace said softly, thinking of Harold and Joseph Clearwater and all the others who had contributed to this moment. "We actually did it." That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Grace sat in her rocking chair watching the daily reunion between little Toby and Mama Wild. The young bobcat positioned himself at the front of his enclosure, while his mother approached from the forest with her characteristic silent grace. For 10 minutes, they communicated in their private language of chirps and purrs, separated by mesh but connected by bonds that transcended physical barriers. Mama Wild would sometimes bring small gifts, an interesting stick, a colorful leaf, once memorably a live mouse that she released near the enclosure as if teaching her son that hunting skills were still important, even if the execution had to be different. "Your daddy always said that love finds a way," Grace told little Toby after Mama Wild had retreated to the forest for the night. "I used to think that was just pretty talk, but I understand now. Love doesn't mean keeping things the same. Sometimes love means helping things become what they're meant to be, even when it's not what we expected." Little Toby chirped softly in response, then settled into his favorite sleeping spot on the heated platform Sam had installed for winter comfort. His routines had become as predictable and comforting as Harold's had once been, marking the rhythm of Grace's days with purpose and meaning. As Grace prepared to go inside for the night, her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Rodriguez at the university. "Funding approved for 5-year study of human-wildlife bond therapy programs. Little Toby is going to be famous." Grace smiled, imagining Harold's reaction to the news. He'd probably shake his head and mutter something about making a big fuss over just doing what needed doing. But she knew he'd be proud of the sanctuary, proud of little Toby's remarkable adaptation, and proud of Grace for finding the courage to honor a promise she'd never known she'd inherited. "Well, Harold," she said to the star-filled sky, using words that had become her evening prayer. "Took me 67 years to figure out what you already knew. Sometimes the best way to heal a broken heart is to trust it to love something that needs healing too." In his enclosure, little Toby settled deeper into sleep, safe and loved, and serving a purpose his wild ancestors could never have imagined. And in the forest, Mama Wild began her nightly patrol, guardian spirit watching over guardian spirit, the ancient promise kept in ways that honored both tradition and change. The sanctuary was quiet now, but it hummed with the potential of all the tomorrows it would bring all the children who would learn compassion by meeting little Toby, all the families who would understand that every life has value, all the connections between human and wild that would be forged in this special place where love had indeed found a way. After 43 years of marriage, Grace thought she knew everything about love and loss. When Harold passed, she felt like her story was ending just another widow marking time in an empty cabin. But sometimes God has different plans. When that desperate mother bobcat brought her injured baby to Grace's door, it wasn't just about saving one little creature. It was about discovering that our greatest chapters can begin when we think the book is almost closed. Grace learned that the promises we inherit from those we've loved don't burden us, they transform us. At 67, she found purpose she never knew existed, built a legacy that touched thousands of lives, and proved that it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. Harold's Secret Wildlife Sanctuary became Grace's gift to the world, showing that sometimes our most meaningful work begins not in youth's ambition, but in wisdom's courage. The love that seemed lost when Harold died had actually been planted like seeds, waiting for Grace to nurture them into something beautiful. Every morning now, watching little Toby thrive despite his challenges, Grace understands that happiness isn't about what we've lost, it's about what we choose to do with what remains. What unexpected purpose has emerged in your life after loss or major change? How has caring for someone or something vulnerable brought new meaning to your golden years? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've discovered new chapters of purpose and joy.